Hi, this is Ryan Anderson with Google in Portland. Welcome to another episode of the Digital Native Podcast, a show where we share the innovative things that engineering leaders are building and what they've learned along the way. Today on the show, we have Erik Onnen. Erik is the CTO of Bump.com. He's previously helped build other tech companies in Portland like Jive, Airship, and Cloudability. Erik, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So I think you have a unique perspective on the technology industry, having been in so many companies and spent a lot of time here. Want to get into that, but before we do, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into technology?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of an interesting path getting into technology. I graduated with a political science degree out of university and environmental science background as well. I certainly took plenty of comp sci courses in college, but that was not what my degree is. My degree was in, and I'd always just been a kid who was fascinated with computers. My mom taught me my first sort of programming exercise, and she would always call the computer repair guy when I would break it. When I had, proud to say I had the first Michelangelo virus on my computer way back in the BBS days and things along those lines. But I was actually hired out of college to be a strategy consultant. So can think of things like setting prices for pharmaceutical drugs for companies like that and that type of work. Almost went to law school as well. And when people at the consultancies I was working for found out that I could write code, they immediately said, "Oh, okay, hang on, we have something else for you to work on." And then that kind of dovetailed into the .com. And I took my first job as a real programmer in the .com days. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of me being in technology. I've been in tech ever since.
No, I love that. And talking about pushing the boundaries on your computer and what you're doing. So you've been in Portland now for, over a decade. How did you end up in Portland, one, and part of kind of the PDX, what we call the startup ecosystem here?
Yeah, I moved here to work for a startup that nobody would have ever heard of. It's you can think of it as it would have been if it was successful, being a competitor to MuleSoft. It was an open source enterprise service bus was the idea of the product. And we had customers. I think there was really good vision. And for reasons that I won't go into that were more like infighting within some of the ownership, things fell apart. And so I liked Portland. I'd been to Portland before. I used to come to OSCON way back in the early days when it was in Portland and had kind of fell in love with it. And when I had an opportunity to move here to work on an open source project, I jumped at it and was lucky enough after that fell apart to I did a stint in really big tech. So I worked for Liberty Mutual for CTO there and worked on a bunch of skunkworks projects, which was a lot of fun. But at the same time, ultimately, a lot of things we did never saw the light of day. So I wanted to get back to actually shipping software that people would use. And from there, transitioned into working at Jive, joined Jive Software before the Series A and left right before the IPO. And that was the beginning of my real sort of Portland tech journey in earnest, I would say, were the Jive days.
Okay, that's great. And it's interesting, you have a unique perspective. What I've noticed in Portland is there's kind of these waves or camps of people. You have the Web Trends group, the Urban Airship group, the Jive group. You've worked at multiple of those camps. So, I mean, from when you got here, to where it is now, I guess, how has the ecosystem evolved and, where do you see it going? What do you see the potential?
Yeah, I think during what I would call the Jive days, a lot of people, not my terminology per se, but a lot of people refer to that as the first wave of Portland tech startups. Mentor Graphics was way before that, but people generally don't talk about that as a wave of tech startups. There were some really interesting things going on in the sense that, for one, people didn't really know how to execute a successful tech startup in Portland. There weren't that many. So you mentioned Web Trends and Jive. We're still kind of learning what it meant to actually build out a SaaS platform, build out enterprise products for people. At the time, there was also a very heavy open source slant to everything that was being done. So, Puppet was in that same sort of class as how I've heard it referred to. Puppet was a huge open source play. Jive had very heavy open source components at the same time. A lot of people don't realize this history, but Matt Tucker, one of the co-founders of Jive, had a vision for what Slack ultimately became. There was an open source XMPP server that Jive had and sold at the time, and eventually sort of abandoned that product, but that was just bad timing. I think that could have become a Slack under different circumstances. And the Linux Foundation was very heavily operating here. Linus Torvalds moved here at around that time, and there was just a huge upsurge of everything's going to be open source and we're going to commercialize that. And if you look at today, that's really fallen by the wayside. You don't hear about many companies, if any, in Portland talking about being a pure open source business play anymore. That's dramatically changed. And I think today now you have waves of people who've been through growth stages with startups in technology companies, and there are people out there who have experience, who know what they're doing. There's some out there that would disagree with me on this, but I do think that there are established talent pools that know how to get companies to certain levels of growth now, and that wasn't the case, back in 2007, 2008 for sure. Otherwise, I think in a lot of ways, you see a bunch of big companies that have satellite offices here now. That was not a thing in 2006 either. So whether it's Airbnb or Google, there's a number of large tech companies that are starting to grow their presences here as well. So AWS, you can throw on that list too.
Yeah, my little brother actually works there, which is fun. We have a nice little family rivalry.
Yep.
So moving more to bump.com, the more I've learned about it, the more that you've shared with me, kind of the more excited I get. I'm somebody who's passionate about technology and investing. Tell us a little bit about what bump.com is, and how it's different from what's currently on the market.
Yeah, so at a high level, you can think of Bumped as a platform for giving users fractional shares of ownership in a company. And the most simple example of how that manifests is a publicly traded company. If somebody wanted to structure a reward or a loyalty program such that rather than getting cash back when I go shop at my favorite coffee store that's a big national chain, I could potentially obtain ownership in that brand as opposed to getting a star or a cup of coffee as a reward, as a virtualized approximation of a reward. And what we believe fundamentally is that level of ownership sort of changes behavior. You walk into a store, you're no longer just a customer, you're now potentially an owner of that. And there's a lot of interesting things that we do. Our CEO, David, has said to me that we couldn't have created this business 4 years ago. And I fundamentally believe that the ability to have fractional shares of ownership. So, we can't reward you a share of Google for shopping somewhere right now. That'd be way too expensive for a single transactional reward, but we could reward you with a fractional share of Google for performing some action. And Bumped is really a platform to allow businesses, you can think of that as financial institutions, you can think of that as large brands. Anybody who wants to run a promotional program, that doesn't even necessarily have to be externally with their customers. That could be something they want to do internally as well. It's a platform that allows fractional share ownership rewards based on meaningful events that happen. And that's what we've created. We have a mobile application that demonstrates that from a retail point of sale perspective, but it is also sort of a B2B offering where we work with large brands to sort of change how they can think about rewarding meaningful behaviors.
Yeah, I love it. And the way that I've heard it described is, the ambition is really to create an entirely new brand loyalty category. It's a different way to interact with your customers. When you talk about, great leadership, oftentimes folks talk about how important ownership is and making your employees feel part of the company mission. And what you guys are doing is really extending that to brands, large companies, in order to connect with their customers in a really unique way.
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of innovation, in my opinion, in the loyalty space over the last decade. And we do think that we've got sort of a unique slant to ownership and rewards and loyalty that is net new to the market.
So who are your customers? I mean, obviously kind of end consumers and folks who can receive these fractional shares are kind of the target. Who else are your customers?
So I differentiate between customers who are people that pay us to use our platform, and that's a more traditional B2B play. Those are enterprises, again, the financial institutions or large brands that want to run promotional activities is one example of that. And then we have users who they may use the Bumped application, the Bumped mobile application, or they may be users that we're behind the scenes processing these rewards, and you don't necessarily see the Bumped mobile application front and center. Ultimately, with our platform, you do end up with a brokerage account, and that is a Bumped brokerage account, regardless of how it's expressed to an end user. But users, people who are receiving these fractional shares of stock, they don't pay us. They're not customers of ours. They consume our services, and we treat them as if they're customers, with the utmost respect and attention to detail and customer service for them. But the people who pay us in the traditional sense of a customer are larger enterprises.
Okay, that's great. And shifting a little bit to your role within Bumped, as CTO, tell us a little bit more about your role, your focus, and the team that you're currently building.
Yeah, so I split my time in three ways at a high level. Number one is sort of on company strategy and direction. So I work closely with the rest of the executive leadership team, with our product team, with the marketing team, with the sales team to make sure that my team is aligned, that they understand the mission and the vision in the company. They understand what their tactical day-to-day work is. So when they're working on a ticket, if I'm performing my role well, they understand how does this contribute to the bigger picture. And then, it's sort of my role to also have some say and point of view in terms of where that strategy goes and how it can align with our technology decisions. I also have people management roles, so we're a relatively small shop right now. So, I have to make sure that my employees are engaged, happy, that they understand their career paths, things along those lines. And then I also spend a lot of my time on some of the more fun parts of my job, with security, compliance, SOC 2 type things. I spend a good chunk of my time just making sure that we've got our operational processes and procedures and checks in place. One of the interesting things about our business is because we do have a fully owned broker dealer as part of Bumped, and we play in a fintech space. We're both a startup, so we have all the normal characteristics of a startup that we need to move quickly. We need to break things. We need to innovate rapidly, but we're in a highly regulated environment at the same time. So there's this constant tension between how to use a small startup, move quickly and break things, but at the same time, don't break things in a way that the regulators are going to be unhappy with. And that's, I think, true of a lot of fintech. And you're seeing that's something else I would highlight is there's a lot of fintech coming up in Portland right now. Simple really started that, but there's been plenty of other fintech companies that are cropping up that I think are doing really cool things. All of them have that same constraint of regulatory banking and move fast as a startup. And it's not easy to play in between those two massive boulders.
Yeah, it's interesting. I try to become customers of all those. I mean, you have CrowdStreet coming up and Simple. With you guys, obviously, you have an early release program right now. Is there a target date on when things will be live or open up to the public? If I'm interested
yes, there is, but I can't speak to it right now, unfortunately. So
okay,
we have
fair.
an internal target date, but I can't communicate that publicly.
Okay, fair. So, COVID-19, it's evolving every day, obviously affecting everyone, both businesses, families. Companies are starting to work more remote. Can you speak to kind of your message to your team, what you guys are going through right now and how you're managing that?
Yeah, so all of Bumped right now is working fully remote. I'll tell you, I think we're blessed that in the tech industry, we have this as an option. There are a lot of people that aren't fortunate enough to be able to just say, okay, I'm going to go work from home. And so I think we really often take it for granted and maybe aren't even grateful enough for the people that don't have that as a luxury. But speaking specifically from my team, in my experience these days, a lot of engineers, a lot of technology people have some experience working remotely. So it wasn't completely jarring for us. A number of us, me included, have worked on fully remote teams for extended periods of time. And some haven't. So, there's some best practices that you try and instill in the team. Wake up in the morning, make yourself breakfast, but get dressed. Don't take meetings in your pajamas and things like that. Try and be cognizant of other people at a heightened level that maybe you wouldn't be if you were having a face-to-face conversation. So communicate publicly and visibly, things along those lines. This is different than having a fully remote team though, right? There's a lot of social distress going on. And right now I'm trying to encourage my team to be honest about how they're feeling, right? If their family's being impacted and that makes it difficult for them to focus, then let's have a conversation about that. If you personally are stressed out about it, then that's something as a manager that I think is important for us to talk about, because it's natural, it's going to happen. We don't need to pretend like we're just going to soldier on and fix all the problems just doing it in a different work environment. This is not the reality of the world that we're living in at this point in time. So, I want to make sure that people feel like they can be open with me as a manager about that, and that they don't feel like they have to sort of suppress these feelings just for the good of the company, because that's not realistic. It's a really complicated situation that we're in. And being as open about it as possible, I think, is really critical right now.
I love that, creating that safety. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the one other thing we have mandated that I like is we kind of culturally would have people join calls and not turn on their video. And we're actually being really adamant that you have to show your face, so that it's not a great substitute, but it's better than nothing in terms of that face-to-face time and just being able to see body language and how people are responding.
It's huge. I mean, having that communication and seeing folks. So obviously that's a challenge. In your experience, you've worked for a lot of different companies over the last decade plus. What do you think some of the top challenges are in general for technology and engineering leaders?
So I think it's more than ever, and this doesn't change, it just gets more and more complicated, but more than ever, the amount of selection, the variety that's out there for off-the-shelf tools for somebody to pick up. There's just been an explosion of tools that you have from cloud vendors like Google that it's almost like it's a domain in and of itself just to understand all the things, let alone be a practitioner and apply them. I did a talk a while ago that talked about it's a full-time job just to keep up with everything going on in the Kubernetes space, let alone the overall cloud computing space. So one of the bigger challenges I see right now is, especially for small and mid-sized teams, there's an allure to saying like, we're going to use 19 different components from a cloud provider to build our solution. But if you're a small team, that might be an oversubscription, right? Nobody's going to use all 19 of those things in anger. Nobody's going to be an expert in depth per se without a significant amount of time. So I think as technologists, we have a general tendency to chase the shiny baubles and go after the net new things, not understanding what the trade-offs of picking up something off the shelf that you've never used before are, how it's going to change your operations, how it's going to change your ability to support your infrastructure and troubleshoot. I tend to think that there's not much of a first mover advantage to being the first bleeding edge adopter of technology right now in infrastructure as a service computing, just because some of the stuff is really not fully baked yet, and there's not a lot of expert practitioners that are out there to tap into if something goes wrong.
Yeah, it's a great message. If you can't do the fundamentals, like any sport, like basketball, you shouldn't be trying to dunk or shoot 3-pointers or do, the more flashy things. So as a leader of a company who's kind of pushing the boundary, doing some more innovative things, where are you getting your information? I mean, is it case studies, white papers, talking to kind of your network and your community? Are you actively looking at product demos?
Probably everything other than product demos. I get constant stream of inbounds of people wanting to do demos and get time on the calendar and things like that. Going into my spam folder is pretty terrifying at this point in terms of the number of things I'm just not even responding to.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, you're not guilty of that, but there are plenty that I have no previous relationship that are just assuming they can have 20 minutes in my calendar tomorrow without even talking to me, which is really kind of an interesting sales tactic. Yeah, I think it's all of the above except for demos. And part of that is because I'm a hands-on learner and most of my team are as well. So if there's something we want to investigate in earnest that might have a chance at making it into our production systems, we're going to go play with it and tinker with it. And being able to get up and running without having to go through a detailed sales pitch and a lengthy process just to try something hands-on is really critical for the way that we operate. But yeah, I can't stress the network enough. I think talking to peers, and if I know that somebody in my network has used a tool and we're thinking about it, I'm going to tap into them aggressively just to understand, like, hey, what went wrong? I want to hear the disaster stories first, and then tell me how it was great and what it helped you with. And yeah, more and more these days, I think it would be an exception for me to say like, hey, I'm going to go stand up this thing by hand in my infrastructure. I'm first looking to a cloud vendor to provide me for something off the shelf so I don't have to operate it.
No, I love that. And that's, I mean, for me, that was a kind of a big reason to create this show, is just to kind of share best practice. What are folks learning? And I'm excited to get into this next part because I think as people, I learn the best just through hearing stories, hearing perspectives from my colleagues, from my customers. You're somebody who now has experience, on-prem, AWS, GCP. Would love to kind of dive into, your how you got introduced to GCP. What was your initial thought process, and how did you determine it was a valuable option?
Yeah, I was introduced through GCP in a prior role. We were AWS customers completely from the ground up from day one, cloud native built in AWS. And had a pretty strong partnership with AWS along the way. And there were one or two technologies. So I had always made it a part of my personal learning process to, for example, go to GCP next, even though I wasn't a Google customer, just to understand the ecosystem, again, to sort of network, hear stories, hear talks around practitioners in particular, talking about how they use the products. I love to hear talks at vendor neutral forums as well. And I'd love to see sort of a cloud vendor neutral forum in Portland. I don't think we have a great one of those right now where people just sort of share war stories without sort of a vendor sponsor looming over that. And yeah, was paying attention. It was clear to me, just given where we were at in Cloudability and the general trends I saw from customers and what I heard from them, that this was really going to be a 3-horse race between the big 3 vendors that have sort of emerged today. And it was clear to me many years ago that I needed to start paying attention to what GCP was doing, both as a practitioner as well as it was in my business interest at the time. And the more I paid attention, the more it was clear, Google's throwing their engineering talent at this as a problem, that they were going to do it right out of the gate, as well as anybody can. I mean, it's really hard to start a cloud business from the ground up. That's why there's only 3 vendors as opposed to a lot more selection out there today. And yeah, I was just really impressed with some of the initial offerings. I think in particular, GCP started to do a good job of having differentiated offers pretty early on, which made me pay more close attention to it too. And then there was a lot of promise in certain technologies, like BigQuery, for example, that we leaned in heavily in a previous role. And when we started using it, at scale, I should say, things did what we expected it to. It was as advertised on the packaging. And that, I think, inspired confidence to experiment with other tools. I really like what GCP has done with GKE, for example. It's something that we use at Bump today very heavily for our production infrastructure. And yeah, solving hard problems that I think at the end of the day, my engineering team could solve those problems, but I would rather they focus on driving business value rather than solving infrastructure problems.
No, that's great. It's interesting how fast, this ecosystem is evolving. I mean, you go back to 2004, 2005, you ask folks, what is cloud? And tell them what that was, they'd say it doesn't exist. And it was there. They were calling it software as a service. Salesforce, Intuit, NetSuite were kind of using that technology, but the fundamental value proposition was convenience. And it's evolved, 2006, 2007, Amazon introduced S3, EC2, and it was about kind of a more of an economic play. I think what we're seeing and what you're speaking to now is kind of this third phase is going more to be about delivering capabilities that, you can't get any other way. I think a lot of this is, hey, we could build that, but we don't want to. Why would we? That's not going to help us differentiate. But speak to, you mentioned a couple of the products you're using, GKE, BigQuery. I'd like to understand a little bit more about which product you're using and what it's enabling you guys to do as a business. And you touched on that briefly.
Sure. So, I mean, we use what are traditionally referred to in my experience as the big 3, right? So there's object storage, volume storage, compute. Almost everybody, that's the majority of cloud spend these days based on my experience at Cloudability. And then we are also users of Cloud Data Store. So a lot of our transactional data is stored in Cloud Data Store. In particular, one thing that I think is interesting that we've done is it tends to model hierarchies for us very well. And a lot of our data fits very well into sort of a hierarchical paradigm. And that's worked phenomenally well for us. You'll see us definitely using more managed relational stores going forward in the future. We are big users of Cloud Dataflow as well. So there's a number of things within our infrastructure where they just make a lot more sense to do in terms of batch settings. One of my favorite things about banking and fintech is everybody always uses, when they talk about ACID transactions, of like, okay, I debited the credit account and money went out, and I only have one single consistent view of that. That's not at all how banking really works. There's a lot of asynchronous large-scale processes that go on behind the scenes. And Dataflow in particular makes it really easy for engineering teams to create these big batch jobs that do analysis that sort of are fundamental underpinnings to a lot of our jobs. I mentioned GKE. We put all of our containers that deployed into GKE into production out of Container Store. We are heavy users of Stackdriver, so a lot of our metrics monitoring, alerting, logging, et cetera, are done through Stackdriver right now. And yeah, we'll just continue to lean more heavily into the Stack for sure over time. Those are the big ones right now that are top of mind.
And any favorite products personally or that are more popular with the team?
I personally think Spanner from like a computer science perspective is fascinating. I mean, that's a great example of something that only a company at the scale of Google could create. As much as I would want to, I think getting atomic clocks in data centers that I would operate just wouldn't even be possible. So things along those lines are fantastic. I personally have had a lot of success with big table-like deployments in the past. So I think that's something that I would like to see us use more of for certain use cases. I didn't mention it, but we use a lot of BigQuery, and we'll just continue to use more and more BigQuery at Bumped as well. Yeah, those are the ones off the top of my head. I like everything we're using. We're happy with all the products we're using. And the other thing that would be on the horizon for us would be using a lot of the machine learning tools that are out there right now too.
No, that's great. That's exciting. So shifting more a bit personal, a couple more questions, but more around kind of you personally. I guess sharing, some of the mistakes that you've made as an engineering leader as you reflect back on how you've evolved and what you've learned along the way. What are some of the most common mistakes, one, that you've made, and then two, that you're seeing kind of in the community with other technology and engineering leaders make?
Yeah, better question would be, what mistakes have I not made? I'm pretty sure I've made all the ones that I'm aware of that can be made that are out there. A couple things, speaking specifically to the leadership part of your question. And I've learned this really the hard way, but I fundamentally believe that we as an industry are moving past the days where we tolerate the grumpy, toxic personality because they're a good technologist in the room. I think team cohesion, people that can collaborate and get along well, as opposed to that one individual high performer who goes off in a corner and emerges with something great. We need to continue to emerge away from that. And I think having somebody on a team who, even if they're performing at a top level, but doesn't have cohesion and doesn't gel well with the rest of the team, is something that in hindsight, I wish I would have corrected much more aggressively than I did. And every time I eventually did correct that, I was glad that I did, and I was remorseful that I hadn't acted sooner on that. Now, there are conditions where that doesn't always apply, but if you have redundancy in certain areas and you have the ability to act on that, then act on it aggressively. That's one piece of advice that I would give to leaders for sure. Yeah, I think one thing I had to learn over time as somebody who was at least a reasonably good practitioner, I think, was that having more empathy and not focusing just on the technology as a leader is really important. There's always stuff going on in people's personal lives. Having what's sometimes called an emotional IQ or an EQ around, let me get into that person's mind space. Let me try and understand what they might be going through, as opposed to just beating them over the head with technology and like helping drive them to a solution and stay focused on execute. That's something that was definitely a part of my evolution as a leader, I think, as well. And it's a softer skill. It's not something that's easily taught. It can be coached into you by really good mentors. But oftentimes we just have technical mentors, not good management mentors that sort of marry the two things together as engineering leaders.
I love that answer. Bill Gates talks about, he was very arrogant when he was young, but as he evolved, he learned there were something like 7 or 8 different types of intelligence, and he had one. And
I was too.
Yeah.
I'll be the first to admit, I was that arrogant guy in the room, and nobody really brought it to my attention in a way that I could correct and evolve and develop. I kind of had to just learn that along the way. And once I did, then I realized kind of, okay, I should have done these things in the past a lot better. Again, not an easy path to go through, and not everybody makes it.
Definitely. But it starts at the top down, and, speaking to that, vulnerability and having that with your team is important. Anything for you that you've changed your mind on in recent history within the last 1 or 2 years?
Maybe if I can cast the window a little bit wider, there was a time where I was, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, where I was an aggressive early adopter of technologies. So, way back in the day, well before it was at a 1.0 stage, I would be deploying Cassandra clusters or working with HBase when it was really in its infancy. And we managed to make that work, and it served a good purpose, but there was so much pain along the way in that learning that somebody who I used to work with had this great saying. He said, well, I submitted my tech talk, but it was denied again. And the title of my talk was Solving Well Understood Problems with Proven Technologies. You don't go to a tech conference and see somebody talk about, I used this 6-year-old solution and and really nailed it in terms of productivity and reliability and availability. So I think in my past, I was always overly aggressive at adopting net new things because they were shiny and they were easy to chase after. And as I've moved more down the leadership path, I'm more cognizant of the trade-offs that are there. And if you don't need it, chasing the net new thing often has a lot of hidden costs and collateral damage associated with it. It's fun as a technologist, and it's sexy to go after that, but it's maybe not the right thing for a business. And that would maybe be the other thing that I would highlight too is I strongly try and convey this to my team and candidates and anybody that'll listen, but generally we're paid to program, right? And the more alignment you have with the business, the more you're going to fit with the organization, the more you're going to help achieve the goals of the business. And I think a lot of technologists just look at things in terms of, I'm solving a technical problem, they don't understand the broader context. And that's super important to do, especially in early to mid stage startups where you don't have a lot of room for redundancy or duplicative work or things along those lines. You want to be aligned with the business and assessing, and what I'm doing today actually contributing value to the business on a daily basis.
That's great. It's not about what the technology does. It's what it enables the business to do. And ultimately your customers. So last couple questions I have for you. First, what advice do you have for young engineers who are just getting started?
I would say, that notion of like arrogance and I know the best technical solution. I realized 10 years into my career how naive it was to have that position out of the gate, and it's hard to recognize in the moment. So one thing I would highlight is always try and start, and this is not even necessarily for young engineers, but I think it's maybe a little bit more applicable. Always try and start from a position of humility and asking questions rather than stating facts and stating like, I know what the answer to this problem is. In a lot of ways, the lack of experience means by definition, you don't actually know the answer to the problem, you have an opinion. So try and approach things from a perspective of like genuine, authentic inquisitiveness, but not, this is a net new technology, we need to use it because clearly it's better than everything that's come before it. Like that, I just see that mistake made all the time, and I will confess to having been guilty of it as well.
I love when you talked about failures. I mean, how do you get good judgment? The only way you get good judgment is you make mistakes by having bad judgment, and that's how we evolve and learn.
Yeah, I've got this super nerdy analogy that I use, which is I used to play Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid. And it's certainly possible for somebody early in their career to come in with a high intelligence score, but your wisdom score is like through the floor. You've got like a 6 on the wisdom scale, even if you're an 18 on the intelligence scale. And wisdom is only accumulated through time. It can't be taught, it's through experience. And that is equally as valuable to being a good programmer or a leader as the wisdom side of things.
No, that's great. So last question to round things out. Tell us something that folks, might not know about you, knowing, what's something that folks might not know about you that's outside of work?
I was born on a farm in Iowa. So we had cows in my backyard and corn and things that you would kind of expect to be present in Iowa. It's funny for me to step back sometimes and think about where I'm at and what I do on a daily basis and how different it is from what I was born into and what my parents knew at the time. And I'll go back and visit every once in a while, and it's just a completely different world, not in a good or a bad way, just different from where I live. And it's weird for me to think that those were my roots and that's where I came from.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Erik, want to thank you again for joining us today. Hopefully folks in the audience found this valuable. Obviously difficult time, so best to you and your team. With the current pandemic, I guess I just want to close by sharing Google's doing a lot there, but specifically with Google Cloud, we're offering 3 months of free training via Pluralsight for all of our potential prospects or customers, whether it's for work or whether individual, it's extracurricular. If that's something you're interested in, let me know. But Erik, want to thank you again. Appreciate your time and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Enjoyed it.